Hey, Jesse here. I am sure you are all fascinated about how the Mongol Empire had never lost a battle, right? Not one. Not in 20 years of continuous warfare across the largest landmass any army had ever crossed. They had burned Bukhara to the ground. They had taken Samarkand, a city of 500,000 people, in 11 days. They had erased Merv so completely that travelers passing through years later described a landscape of bones with no living thing in sight. Every army that had stood in front of them had broken. Every city that had refused to open its gates had been turned into a lesson for the next city. The system was perfect, the record was clean. And then in the spring of 1221, in a mountain valley in what is now Afghanistan, a man with no country, no treasury, no empire, and no realistic path to survival looked at 30,000 Mongol veterans and broke that record. His name was Jalal ad-Din Mingburnu. He was the last crown prince of the Khwarazmian Empire, a civilization that, by the time this story happens, had already been destroyed. His father was dead. His brothers were dead. The great cities his family had ruled, Bukhara, Samarkand, Urgench, were ash. The army his father had commanded had been scattered across 1,000 miles of wreckage. He had no throne to defend, no palace to return to, no treasury to pay soldiers with, and no formal allies who could offer him anything beyond the temporary use of their men. What he had was the valley in front of him, the mountain terrain on both sides of it, and one understanding of his enemy so precise that it turned 30,000 veterans into a problem he could solve. This is not the story most people know about the Mongol conquests. Most accounts give you the sweep and the scale, the distances, the destruction, the seemingly unstoppable momentum of an empire that rewrote the map of the world. They give you the Mongols as a force of nature. What they leave out is this specific valley, this specific man, and the specific order he gave that morning that no cavalry commander in the world would have given, and that won the battle before the first contact was made. What you're about to hear is the story of how the only man alive who had nothing left to protect turned out to be the most dangerous man the Mongol Empire had ever faced, and why, the moment that danger passed, it destroyed itself in a matter of hours over a dispute about horses. This channel exists for exactly these stories, the ones that don't survive in the two-paragraph version, because the two-paragraph version can't hold what actually happened. If you're the kind of person who wants the full account, stay with me. And if this is your first time here and this is the kind of history you've been looking for, subscribe. It helps this story reach the people who would genuinely want to hear it. Now, to understand what happened in that valley, you need to understand what the Mongol Empire actually was, because the most powerful army in the world doesn't begin to cover it. In 1220, Genghis Khan walked into the Friday Mosque at Bukhara, one of the great centers of Islamic learning and commerce in Central Asia, a city of perhaps 300,000 people, and told the assembled population something that the Persian chronicler Juwayni recorded and that no one who heard it forgot. He told them he was the punishment of God, that if they had not committed great sins, God would not have sent a punishment like him. Whether he believed this or whether it was calculated theater, the effect was the same. Bukhara fell. Its scholars, merchants, craftsmen, and soldiers were sorted into those who would be used and those who would not. The city was burned. The population was dispersed, killed, or enslaved. And the Mongol army moved on to the next city with exactly the same efficiency it had brought to the previous one, because the system Genghis Khan had built was not a collection of violent men. It was a precision instrument, and it had been refined through 20 years of continuous operation across the largest landmass any army had ever moved across. To understand why Parwan was possible, you must first understand what the Mongol military system actually was, because most people's mental image of it, a vast horde of wild horsemen crashing into poorly organized opponents, is precisely wrong. The Mongol army that moved into Khwarazmian territory in 1219 was organized on a decimal system. Every 10 men formed an arban, commanded by a leader chosen for competence. 10 arbans formed a zun 100, 10 zuns formed a mingan 1,000, 10 mingans formed a tumen 10,000. This structure, running from the individual rider to the Kagan himself, created a communications and command system that could coordinate complex maneuvers across distances that would have paralyzed any contemporary European or Islamic army. Every Mongol rider maintained his own equipment. The composite bow he carried was not a simple wooden ark. It was a laminated construction of horn, wood, and sinew that had been built over years, with a draw weight that modern reconstructions measure at approximately 160 pounds, giving it an effective range of 200 to 300 meters and a maximum range exceeding 500. Each rider carried a minimum of 60 arrows in 2 quivers. Each rider maintained a string of 3 to 5 remounts, not pack animals, but trained war horses, which meant the Mongol army could sustain a pace of movement that no enemy could match, arriving where it was not expected at a speed that compressed the time available for any organized defense. The tactical system itself was built around a principle that the Mongol commanders had practiced until it was automatic: locate the enemy, fix the enemy's attention with pressure, and then use superior mobility to find and exploit a weakness in the formation. The feigned retreat, where a portion of the Mongol force would appear to break and run, drawing the pursuing enemy out of formation and into open ground where they could be surrounded and destroyed, had worked so many times that experienced commanders in other armies gave standing orders against pursuit. Those orders were very difficult to obey when the Mongols were running. The psychological dimension of this system was as important as its mechanics. By 1219, the Mongol reputation had preceded the Mongol army into every theater where it operated. Cities surrendered without siege. Commanders capitulated rather than wait for assault. Populations fled rather than endure the alternative. The Mongols understood this and invested actively in the reputation, the deliberate, total destruction of cities that resisted, as contrasted with relatively lenient treatment of those who submitted immediately, was not random violence. It was a communication strategy. The message was, resistance is irrational. Submission is survival. The army was the advertisement. And then there was the intelligence operation. The Mongols maintained a network of spies, merchants, defectors, and emissaries that gave their commanders detailed information about enemy force dispositions, supply routes, internal political divisions, and terrain long before their cavalry arrived. They knew what they were attacking before they attacked it. Their enemies, almost without exception, were still trying to understand what they were facing when the first contact was made. This is the machine that destroyed the Khwarazmian Empire, not a horde, not a lucky wave of nomadic violence. A system operating at full efficiency against an opponent that had no adequate answer for it. The opponent's choices made it worse. Sultan Muhammad II, faced with an invasion force that his intelligence network had seriously underestimated, Mongol information discipline was such that even experienced observers could not reliably assess their actual numbers, made the single strategic decision that the Mongol system was perfectly designed to exploit. Rather than concentrating his forces to meet the invasion at a single point where numerical mass might compensate for tactical disadvantage, he distributed his troops across garrison points throughout the empire. The military logic behind this was superficially rational. A distributed force defends more territory and forces the attacker to besiege multiple points rather than achieving a single decisive engagement. The practical effect against the Mongol system specifically was catastrophic. A distributed force can be isolated. It cannot reinforce itself quickly. It must watch one garrison fall, then the next, without being able to concentrate the strength to stop any of them. The Sultan had turned his army into a series of individual targets and handed the Mongols the initiative to engage them in whatever sequence and at whatever pace they chose. By 1220, Bukhara had fallen. Samarkand had surrendered. Merv, a city that Persian sources describe as one of the greatest in the Islamic world, was taken, its population sorted, and according to Ibn al-Athir, the dead were so numerous that bodies blocked roads. These figures in the sources are almost certainly exaggerated in the medieval fashion, and modern scholars are careful about accepting them literally. But the physical reality of what happened to these cities is not in dispute. They were destroyed in ways from which they would not fully recover for generations. The Sultan fled west. 2 Mongol generals, Jabi and Subutai, were dispatched to find him and, finding him, to continue west in what became one of the most ambitious reconnaissance operations in military history. The Sultan reached an island in the Caspian Sea where he died in December 1220, reportedly of pleurisy, alone, without his symbols of office, without an army, without a court, without the empire that had defined his identity. He had time in those final weeks to name his successor. He named Jalal ad-Din. There was nothing left to inherit. Jalal ad-Din Mingburnu had spent most of his adult life being told he was the wrong choice. His mother was a concubine, not a princess, not a Kongli Turk, not the politically correct background for a crown prince at a court where the queen mother, Turken Khatun, was Kongli by birth and controlled a significant portion of the army through direct tribal loyalty. Turken Khatun had her own candidates for succession, younger sons whose blood connection to the Kongli military establishment would secure the loyalty of the cavalry backbone of the Khwarazmian state. Jalal ad-Din had been formally set aside as heir in favor of a younger half-brother. His entire political existence at his own father's court was one of marginalization, of being the capable son who was not the right son. What this marginalization actually produced, though no one understood it as such at the time, was a man who had learned to operate without institutional support. While his half-brothers were cultivating court favor and Turken Khatun's patronage, Jalal ad-Din was learning what it took to lead men who had no particular reason to follow him except his demonstrated competence. He had the reputation before the Mongol invasion of being an exceptional soldier, a horseman, a fighter, physically formidable, but also politically difficult, too aggressive, too independent, too unwilling to manage the factional calculations that court life required. His father found him useful in a crisis and inconvenient in peace. When the crisis came, inconvenient became essential. As the Mongol invasion dismantled the empire piece by piece and the Sultan's strategy of distributed defense collapsed systematically, Jalal ad-Din argued for exactly what the military situation required: concentrated resistance, a decisive engagement before the empire's garrisons were picked off individually. His father did not listen. The argument between them about how to respond to the invasion is recorded in Nasawi's biography and carries across 8 centuries the specific texture of a son watching a father make a catastrophic error in slow motion, powerless to stop it. The Sultan fled, the empire fell, and then the formal transfer happened. A dying man on a Caspian island naming the son he had marginalized his entire life as the heir to nothing. Jalal ad-Din received this inheritance somewhere in the Afghan frontier. The exact location is not recorded in the sources with precision. What is recorded is what he did with it. He did not flee to India, which would have been safe. He did not surrender, which would have been rational in any conventional military calculus. He moved into the Afghan highlands and began looking for people who would fight with him. This was not a straightforward proposition. He had no treasury. He had no functioning administrative apparatus. He could not pay salaries. He could not promise lands because the lands he might have promised were either already under Mongol control or soon would be. What he could offer was something more elemental: demonstrated competence, proximity to an enemy that was coming regardless, and the specific proposition that dying fighting was preferable to dying waiting. His first opportunity came at Ghazni in the Afghan interior, where he assembled a small force and engaged a Mongol detachment. The sources disagree on the details of this engagement. Nasawi gives more credit to Jalal ad-Din's generalship than the Mongol sources acknowledge, as would be expected, but the outcome is not disputed. He won. The detachment was defeated. The Mongol force in the region, accustomed to the pattern of Khwarazmian armies breaking and fleeing, encountered instead an opponent who stayed on the ground and pressed the fight. That victory was not significant in military terms. In recruitment terms, it was everything. The Kalash chieftains of the Afghan interior were practical men. They had watched the Mongol wave destroy everything to the north and west. They were not idealists about Jalal ad-Din's political legitimacy. The crown of Khwarazm meant relatively little to tribal leaders who had operated independently of the Khwarazmian state even at its height. What they responded to was simpler. Here was a man who had fought Mongols and won. In a world where that was unprecedented, it was enough to begin a conversation. There was also a calculation of alternatives. The college lived in the mountains that the Mongols would eventually need to move through. Submission would bring Mongol administration, Mongol taxation, and Mongol incorporation into the military structure of an empire they had no part in building. Resistance, if resistance was possible, and the Ghazni engagement suggested it might be, at least offered the prospect of negotiating from a position of demonstrated cost. These were not people joining a crusade. They were making a pragmatic assessment of how to survive. The Kangli Turks who joined Jalal ad-Din's coalition brought a different calculation and a particular irony. The Kangli were the tribal group from which his mother had been excluded, the group Turken-Kadın had mobilized against his succession. Separated from her political web by the collapse of the empire and the dispersal of the court, these Kwangli cavalry officers found themselves on the Afghan frontier with professional skills, horses, and no employer. Jalal ad-Din offered them one. And there was Timur Melik, the former governor of Kholjand, who arrived in Jalal ad-Din's camp carrying one of the most remarkable personal military records in the entire Mongol campaign. When the Mongols had besieged Kholjand, Timur Melik had held a river island fortress with a small garrison using fire ships and riverine tactics, fighting the Mongol river crossing to a standstill before the weight of numbers finally made the position untenable. He then organized his survivors onto boats and fought a running engagement down the Sir Darya River for weeks, burning boats behind him to deny them to Mongol pursuit, fighting off cavalry attacks from both banks, eventually reaching safety, having lost the city. But having preserved his men and his professional credibility intact, he arrived in Jalal ad-Din's camp as a refugee and a legend simultaneously. By early 1221, Jalal ad-Din had assembled something that no Persian chronicle written in the previous year would have thought possible. A coalition with enough strength, enough experience, and enough coherent leadership to constitute a genuine military force. Not the army of a great empire. Something different, an alliance of men who had been left standing when the empire fell, held together by one man's will and one shared circumstance. The Mongols were coming whether they fought or not, and Jalal ad-Din had figured out how to make fighting back something other than suicide. Shigikutuku received his orders. He would go south and finish what the campaign had left unfinished. The coalition that gathered around Jalal ad-Din in the Afghan highlands was not an army in the way that Shigikutuku's force was an army. It had no unified supply system, no standardized equipment, no common training doctrine, and no loyalty that extended beyond what the immediate situation demanded. What it had was specific. The college fighters knew the Hindu Kush, the way the Mongol cavalry knew the open steppe, not as terrain to be traversed, but as ground that was part of their physical understanding of the world. They knew which passes closed in late spring with remaining snow. They knew which valley floors ran soft and treacherous with snowmelt in March, and which ridgelines offered stable footing and clear lines of fire. They knew where a horse could move at speed and where it could not. This knowledge was not strategic. It was biological, accumulated over generations of living in these mountains. It was, at Parwan, worth more than any amount of tactical doctrine that had been developed for open ground cavalry warfare. The surviving Khwarazmian professional cavalry brought something different: the specific experience of having fought the Mongols and survived. This is not a minor thing. An army that has faced a particular opponent multiple times carries in its body a calibrated understanding of that opponent's rhythm, the speed of the charge, the pattern of the arrow release, the timing of the feigned retreat. Soldiers who had run from the Mongols and survived knew with a precision that no intelligence briefing could provide exactly what the Mongol cavalry looked and felt like at 30 meters in a charge. That knowledge was of negative value. In most contexts, it had trained them to run. At Parwan, under a commander who would not let them run, it was potentially useful in a different way. Timur Melik's personal following brought professional cohesion and, more importantly, the psychological authority of a commander whose personal record of resistance was not theoretical. Men follow proven fighters differently than they follow men who have merely claimed courage. Timur Melik had proved his under conditions that most of the coalition had only heard about. The coalition's weaknesses were equally specific, and Jalal ad-Din could not have been ignorant of them. The tribal structure that gave the college their cohesion and their territorial knowledge also gave them a framework for distributed decision-making that was incompatible with the kind of unified command that a pitched battle required. College chieftains consulted within their own groups, managed their own men according to their own customs, and would accept direction from Jalal ad-Din only as long as that direction appeared competent and the situation remained manageable. The moment Jalal ad-Din made a decision that a chieftain found unacceptable, the chieftain's compliance became optional. In an emergency, this was workable. In the aftermath of a battle, when the emergency was over and the distribution of spoils began, it was a structural disaster waiting to happen. There were also the competing personal histories. Timur Melik's followers and the Kengli cavalry had their own internal politics, their own claims to precedence, their own calculations about what they were owed for their service. A coalition army is always a negotiation. The negotiation can be managed as long as the threat that created the coalition remains present and immediate. The moment that threat recedes, even temporarily, even partially, the negotiation reasserts itself in full. Jalal ad-Din knew this. Nasawi, who knew him personally and wrote within living memory of these events, describes him as a man of exceptional political intelligence alongside his military ability, someone who understood the dynamics of the people around him with unusual clarity. Whether he fully calculated the specific risk that the post-battle fracture would represent is impossible to know from the sources. What is clear is that he understood going into Parwan that his window was narrow. He needed a decisive engagement on terrain he could control before the coalition's internal tensions had time to resolve themselves in the wrong direction. Shigi Kutuku was moving south. The window was opening. Jalal ad-Din moved his force north toward the Gorband Valley. The Gorband Valley runs roughly north-south through the Hindu Kush highlands, cut by the Gorband River, which was running hard with snowmelt in the spring of 1221. The valley floor sits at somewhere between 1,500 and 2,000 meters above sea level. On both sides, ridgelines rise sharply, not the gentle hills of agricultural lowlands, but the abrupt rocky shoulders of mountain terrain where the footing alternates between solid rock and loose scree, depending on the exposure and the season. The valley narrows in multiple places. In the narrowest sections, the space available for lateral movement, the room a cavalry force needs to execute the flanking maneuvers that were the foundation of Mongol tactical doctrine, compresses to a fraction of what the open steppe provided. A force moving through such a constriction cannot spread its front. It cannot send fast-moving units around the outside of an opposing formation to find weaknesses in the flanks and rear. It must essentially push forward through the available space or stop. The ridgelines above were a different kind of problem for an attacking cavalry force. Horses can climb slopes, but not at the speed that makes cavalry combat effective. A horse moving uphill on rocky terrain is slower, less stable, and more vulnerable than the same horse on level ground. Dismounted men on a ridgeline, men with bows who know the footing, who can move laterally along the ridge faster than cavalry, can work up the slope toward them, hold a structural advantage over the attacking force that numbers alone cannot overcome. You cannot charge a ridgeline the way you charge a battle line on open ground. Jalal ad-Din had not found this valley by accident. He had moved his force into this specific geography deliberately, with a specific understanding of what the terrain would demand of an attacking cavalry force. The college fighters who knew these mountains had described what he was now looking at, and he had recognized in that description an opportunity that only existed in one direction. He had to be here, waiting when Shigi Kutuku arrived. Shigi-Kutuku could not be allowed to choose a different battlefield. He could not be, because on any other battlefield, the plains of Persia, the flat approaches to Ghazni, the open valleys farther east, Jalal ad-Din's coalition would lose. The Mongol cavalry needed space to do what it did. Jalal ad-Din's job was to take that space away before the first contact. The air at this elevation in spring was cold in the mornings and thin enough that men from lower altitudes felt it in their chests and legs. The river noise filled the valley bottom. The ridgelines above caught the morning light before the valley floor did, which meant that defenders on those ridgelines could see the approach of cavalry below them, moving through shadow, footing uncertain, horses visible against the valley floor before the cavalry could effectively assess what was waiting for them above. The Mongol force moved south along the valley. They had driven Khwarazmian armies before them for 2 years. The pattern was known. The pattern was apply pressure, watch for the break, pursue through the break, and the battle is over before noon. Shigi-Kutuku brought his veterans into a valley where that pattern was about to become a trap. The first contact told Shigi-Kutuku something that the reconnaissance had not fully conveyed. The ground was worse than expected, and the men on it were not behaving the way Khwarazmian forces had behaved. The Mongol cavalry's standard opening aggressive pressure across a broad front designed to locate weaknesses in the opposing formation, while the psychological weight of the advance did its own work on the enemy's nerve, could not achieve its full width in the valley's constricted sections. The front that Shigi-Kutuku could present was narrower than he needed. The flanking probes that his commanders sent to find the edges of Jalal ad-Din's position ran into ridgeline terrain that horses could not ascend at combat speed. The probes pulled back. The flanks had nowhere to go. On the valley floor and the lower slopes, the Mongol arrow volleys coordinated releases from hundreds of bows simultaneously, a sound described in sources across multiple cultures as resembling a sudden rainstorm hitting stone, met a problem they had rarely encountered. The men they were aimed at were not presenting themselves in the open formation that made massed archery devastating. They were using the broken terrain. They were behind rocks. They were on slopes that angled the arrow's point of impact differently than flat ground. They were lower than expected and higher than expected simultaneously, which meant that a release calibrated for one target was frequently wrong for the next, and they were not running. This was the first day's most significant military development, and it deserves full attention. The psychological architecture of the Mongol tactical system depended, in part, on the enemy breaking before the physical destruction was complete. The reputation, the noise, the speed, the precision of the advance, all of it was designed to reach a tipping point in the enemy's nerve before the enemy's body was actually destroyed. Most armies broke before they were annihilated. They broke because their soldiers made a rational calculation, or an instinctive one, that running offered better odds than staying. Jalal ad-Din's men were not running, and they were not running because he had made running impossible. The order to dismount had been given before the first Mongol. Rider was visible. He had positioned his cavalry on the ridge lines and the rocky slopes on either side of the valley floor. Good ground for a man on foot, impassable at cavalry speed, defensible from above, and told them to leave their horses behind the line. Fight from here. Do not look at the horses. The horses are not for today. The reasons he gave, if he gave reasons, are not recorded. What Nazawi records is the decision itself and its effect. What we can reconstruct from everything else we know about this man is the logic underneath it. He knew his cavalry. He had watched Khwarazmian cavalry in action against the Mongols. The trained soldier in that situation had one deeply conditioned reflex when the pressure became serious: mount and move. It was not cowardice. It was the survival pattern that had kept these men alive through 2 years of losing. The horse was always the exit. Preserve the horse. When things go wrong, use the exit. At Parwan, using the exit meant losing. Losing on this ground meant losing the coalition, losing the recruitment credibility, losing the one chance Jalal ad-Din had calculated was available to him in this terrain at this moment. He could not inspire his men past that. Survival reflex, no speech, no matter how delivered, reaches past 2 years of conditioned behavior in the heat of a Mongol assault. He could only remove the reflex's instrument. No horse means no exit. No exit means the man in front of you is the only thing left to deal with. No exit, combined with ground that genuinely favored the defender, combined with a commander who had told them this was survivable and had been right before these things together, produced what speeches could not. Men who stayed on their ridge lines and held their positions through the first day of a Mongol assault. The feigned retreat, which should have been available to Shigikutuku as a tool for drawing Jalal ad-Din's cavalry off the high ground and into open valley floor, where they could be surrounded. The classic Mongol killing move could not be cleanly executed in a valley where the ground behind the retreating force was as restrictive as the ground in front of it. A feigned retreat works when the pursuing force can be led onto open ground and then enveloped. It does not work when the pursuing force, moving downhill from a ridgeline position, emerges into a narrow valley floor and finds the retreating cavalry already regrouped on the far side of a river. The geography ate the tool. By nightfall of the first day, neither side had broken. The Mongol force had not achieved the rapid rupture their doctrine required. They had not turned Jalal ad-Din's flanks. They had not created the conditions for pursuit. They had pushed into a valley that had given them nothing, and the men they were pushing against were still there. Shigikutuk's veterans made camp on the valley floor. Across the broken ground above them, Jalal ad-Din's coalition did the same. Tomorrow would be different. Both sides knew it. For different reasons, both sides were right. Dawn of the second day, and the Mongol force was still, by every conventional military measure, the superior force in this valley. Better equipped individually, more experienced in complex coordinated maneuvers, numerically comparable on the battle-ready count, backed by an empire with a functional logistics system versus an alliance of refugees living on what they could carry. What they had lost overnight was not visible on any order of battle, and Shigikutuku may not have fully calculated it when he committed his veterans to the second day's assault. The Mongol tactical system's power was not purely mechanical, it was also psychological, and the psychological dimension had two components that usually operated simultaneously: the Mongols' own absolute certainty in their superiority and the enemy's certainty of the same thing. Both elements had functioned perfectly in every previous engagement. The enemy's nerve had always been the first casualty, breaking before the physical destruction was complete. The men on the ridgelines above Shigikutuku had spent a night that should have been impossible by recent precedent. They had held against a Mongol assault for a full day. They were still here. Whatever the Mongol assault felt like from the inside, and the research tells us it was designed to be physically and psychologically overwhelming. Before first contact, they had experienced it and not broken. The certainty that Jalal ad-Din had built into their position with the dismount order had, through the test of the first day, become something else. Evidence. They had evidence now from their own experience that the ground held, that staying was survivable, that the system had limits. Jalal ad-Din had been waiting for this moment. He had designed for it. The first day was not a defense. It was the first half of an argument. The second day was the conclusion. He remounted his cavalry. The men who had spent a day on foot, on ridge lines, holding a Mongol assault, now had their horses back. They came down off the slopes onto the valley floor with the specific momentum that only men who have just proved something have, not wild, not reckless, but absolutely certain. The Mongol formation, which had been pressing uphill against defensive positions for an entire day, was now facing a coordinated attack from men moving toward them, and the terrain that had prevented the Mongols from flanking the day before now prevented the Mongols from cleanly disengaging to reset. The feigned retreat, that most reliable of Mongol tools, requires open ground behind the retreating force. It requires room to regroup, to loop around, to set the envelopment. The Gorban Valley, in the sections where the fighting had concentrated, did not have that room. A Mongol unit that turned to execute a feigned retreat in a narrow valley defile was not executing a tactical maneuver. It was adding physical distance to an attacking enemy without being able to offer that enemy an empty field to be trapped on. The tool did not work. The Mongol formation began to come apart under the pressure of Jalal ad-Din's charge, combined with the continued fire from Khalaj and Afghan fighters on the ridgelines, who now had the additional advantage of shooting at a force in motion and partial disorder rather than a force pressing forward in disciplined assault. An arrow into a cavalry formation attacking uphill is one thing. An arrow into a cavalry formation trying to maintain cohesion in a narrow valley while being pressed from the front and flanked from above is another thing entirely. The moment the coherence broke, the exact moment that individual Mongol commanders began making individual decisions rather than operating within the coordinated unit structure, the mountain terrain became lethal in a new way. A retreating cavalry force in a narrow valley with hostile fighters on the ridgelines is not retreating. It is in a corridor. The men above can move along the ridgeline faster than the cavalry can move through the constricted floor below them. The arrows follow the retreat. The ground does not open up ahead. Shigi Kutuk's force broke. Not bent, not withdrew in good order to reassess, broke, routed. The valley that had served Jalal ad-Din as a defensive position for a day and a half became, in the afternoon of the second day, a pursuit ground, and the Mongol army that had shattered cities from the Yellow River to the Persian Gulf was running through it. Shigi Kutuku escaped with a portion of his command. The men who didn't escape died in the valley or in the pursuit that followed it. The battle that everyone Mongol commanders, Khwarazmian refugees, Khalaj chieftains, and almost certainly most of Jalal ad-Din's own soldiers on the morning of day one had expected to end in another Mongol victory had ended the only other way it could have ended. A Mongol army sent by Genghis Khan himself, commanded by his adopted brother and the empire's chief justice, had been destroyed in a mountain valley by a coalition of refugees, displaced fighters, and tribal warriors, following a prince who had nothing left to lose. If you've stayed with this story this far, I want to ask you something directly. The Mongols had just lost a battle they should have won by every conventional measure. Not a skirmish, not a costly tactical success. A rout. What do you think broke first, the formation or the assumption that the formation could not break? Think about that and drop your answer in the comments. I genuinely want to know where you land on it. And if this is the kind of historical storytelling that reaches you, the kind that gets underneath the outcome to the decisions that produced it, please consider subscribing. There are more stories like this one, and every person who subscribes helps make sure they find the people who would actually want to hear them. Now, the horses. In the valley and on the ridge lines around Parwan, in the hours after the rout, there were thousands of Mongol horses. Captured war horses were not minor spoils. In the military economy of Central Asia in 1221, a trained Mongol war horse represented significant wealth, equipment, transportation, fighting capacity, and perhaps most importantly in the immediate context, the specific symbol of a victory whose full scale was still being processed by everyone in the camp. The men who had held those ridgelines, who had followed a prince with no treasury down off the slopes and into a cavalry charge against the finest riders in the world, those men looked at the horses in the valley and saw what the horses represented, theirs. The tribal framework of the Khalaj and the Kongli was unambiguous on this point. Captured goods belonged to the men who captured them, distributed according to established clan custom. There was no legitimate authority that could override that custom, not without violating the foundational social contract that held the tribal alliance together. The Khalaj chieftains had not joined Jalal ad-Din's coalition in exchange for salary or land grants. They had joined in exchange for the opportunity to fight on their own terms and keep what they won. The horses were what they won. Timur Melik's position was different and equally specific. He commanded a personal following of professional soldiers whose loyalty was to him directly. His calculation of what his contribution to the battle entitled him to was based on a different framework, a more hierarchical one, closer to the old Khwarazmian military structure, where senior commanders were entitled to a proportionate share of captured materials regardless of which specific men had taken them in the field. He wanted his share. He was not wrong by his own framework. Nasawi, who recorded this episode with visible frustration in his biography of Jalal ad-Din, describes what followed as an armed confrontation between factions that had been 12 hours earlier fighting together on the same ground. The exact sequence of the argument and its escalation is not reconstructed identically in every source, but the outcome is clear. Timur Melik's faction and the college leadership came to weapons. Jalal ad-Din intervened. He could not resolve it. This is the sentence that carries the story's full weight. He could not resolve it, not, would not, could not. The man who had held disparate fighters together through 2 days of impossible battle, who had made his cavalry dismount, who had designed a position around his own men's weakness and his enemy's assumptions, this man, in the hours after his greatest military achievement, faced a problem his intelligence and will could not solve, because the problem was not tactical, it was structural. The coalition had been built on a set of conditions: an immediate present threat, a competent commander, a shared impossibility that had held incompatible frameworks in temporary alignment. The moment the immediate threat receded, even partially, the incompatible frameworks reasserted themselves. The horses were not the cause of the fracture. They were the surface where the fracture that had always existed finally became visible. Timur Melik separated from the coalition. The man who had held the river at Khojend against the full weight of the Mongol army, who had fought down the Sir Darya in boats for weeks, who had arrived in Jalal ad-Din's camp as one of the most valuable military assets in the Islamic world, this man, in the aftermath of the one genuine victory against the Mongols, rode away from it because of horses. He did not do it out of treachery. He did not calculate that abandoning the coalition would benefit him strategically. He did it because the horses were his by right. And Jalal ad-Din could not or would not impose the resolution that would have kept him. Whether Jalal ad-Din should have overridden the custom, taken the horses centrally, and held the coalition by force of command is a question the sources do not answer, and the situation probably could not have sustained. An alliance held by compulsion over its members' fundamental frameworks is not an alliance. It is a captive audience, and it becomes dangerous the moment it feels captive. What is certain is the result. The force that had beaten Shigi-Kutuku's 30,000 veterans left the Gorband Valley significantly smaller, significantly less coherent, and moving toward a confrontation with a force that the complete coalition would have had difficulty facing, because Genghis Khan had received his news. The secret history of the Mongols records what Genghis Khan said to Shigi-Kutuku when the report of Parwan arrived. He told him it was the first time he had been defeated. He told him to study what had happened and learn from it. He did not punish him. In a military culture where failure regularly produced executions, demotions, and the kind of public disgrace that preceded both, Genghis Khan's response to the news that his adopted brother and Chief Justice had been routed in Afghanistan was, by the standards of his own system, remarkably measured. This restraint is itself a document. The Mongol system was not simply brutal, it was precisely brutal. Violence was directed where it served specific purposes, and Shigi-Kutuku's execution would not have served any purpose that Genghis Khan needed served. Kutuku had not been defeated because he was incompetent or cowardly. He had been defeated because he had encountered a specific combination of factors: terrain, command, and the specific decision about the horses that the doctrine had not been built to handle. Punishing Kutuk for failing to solve a problem the doctrine had never anticipated would have sent the wrong message to every other commander in the Mongol system. Do not encounter new problems. What Genghis Khan understood from the report, and he would have asked very specific questions because the Mongol intelligence process did not stop at defeat, was that Jalal ad-Din had used the mountains in a way that no one had anticipated, and that Jalal ad-Din himself had become, in the ruins of everything he was supposed to inherit, a genuinely dangerous problem. He came himself. This decision to personally take the field against the last prince of a civilization already destroyed, rather than send a corrected force under a different subordinate, is the clearest possible measure of what Parwan had meant. Genghis Khan was approximately 59 years old. He was past the age at which most medieval commanders needed to be in the field personally. He had the system and the personnel to dispatch another army. He chose not to. Whether this was a matter of strategic priority, Jalal ad-Din, if left unchecked, could rebuild around the victory of Parwan and draw serious resistance from every corner of the region that had not yet fully submitted, or a matter of something more personal, the sources do not resolve with certainty. Giovanni's account implies both. He organized his available forces and moved south toward the Indus River. Jalal ad-Din had been informed. He moved his reduced coalition, smaller now, missing Timur Melik's professional following, carrying the internal fractures that the horse dispute had opened, if not yet fully split, toward the same geography that had defined his entire war, a river crossing, a mountain approach, ground where the Mongol cavalry's advantages might be compressed. He was doing what he had always done, looking for the right terrain. The problem was that the coalition he brought to the Indus was not the coalition that had held at Parwan. The Indus River in November 1221 was cold, fast, and deep. Behind Jalal ad-Din was the Mongol army of Genghis Khan, not a detachment, not a regional force, but the personal campaign force of the man who had destroyed everything Jalal ad-Din had ever known. In front of him was a river with no bridge and no boats, running between banks that offered no easy crossing for an army. He had fewer men than he had brought to Parwan. The coalition that had broken the Mongol myth in the Gorband Valley had broken itself in the days that followed, over horses, over the irreconcilable gap between what different groups of men understood themselves to be owed. What remained at the Indus was the core, the men who had followed Jalal ad-Din, too long to stop following him now, the Kongli cavalry who had nowhere else to be, the personal retinues who had become, in the 2 years of loss and occasional improbable success, something more like a family than an army. He positioned them on the western bank and fought. The battle that followed the Battle of the Indus, November 1221, is not Parwan. It does not have Parwan's geometry of chosen terrain and calibrated disadvantage converted to advantage. It has the geometry of a man fighting with his back to a river, with a reduced force against an enemy who had learned from the last encounter and brought enough force to ensure there would not be a third one. Jalal ad-Din fought well. The sources, including Giovanni, who was writing from within the Mongol patronage tradition and had no obvious motivation to credit his enemy's performance, described the battle on the Indus as hard contested, and Jalal ad-Din's personal combat as exceptional. He was fighting by this point not with any realistic expectation of winning. He was fighting because he was Jalal ad-Din Mingburnu, and fighting was what remained. At some point in the battle's final phase, with his formation breaking and the river at his back, he rode to the edge of the bank. His horse was still under him. The river was in front of him. He put his shield on his back, the sources say, and rode into the Indus. Giovanni records that Genghis Khan, watching from the eastern bank, pointed Jalal ad-Din out to his sons. The gesture, as Giovanni renders it, was something between admiration and instruction. Here is what a prince should be. The river took him, or rather the river gave him what his own army and his own empire never quite had, the one thing that Genghis Khan could not cross. Jalal ad-Din reached the far bank and disappeared into the forests of northwestern India. Genghis Khan did not pursue into the subcontinent. The sources offer varying explanations, logistical concerns, the climate, the unfamiliarity of the terrain, a reported omen involving a rhinoceros that most scholars treat as legendary. What is clear is that the pursuit ended at the river's edge. The last prince of Khwarazm was alive. He was on the wrong side of the Indus with almost nothing in a country that was not his. But he was alive. He had, from a starting position of total institutional destruction, managed to be alive. And for a man whose civilization had been erased, whose father had died alone on an island, whose brothers had been hunted down alive, was a form of victory that the Mongol system had not provided to anyone else who stood and fought. For approximately a decade after the Indus, Jalal ad-Din Mingburnu refused to stop. He spent time in the Indian subcontinent, probably in the regions under the rule of the Sultan of Delhi, Iltutmish, who, with the specific political calculation of a man who understood what having Jalal ad-Din close would cost him in Mongol attention, declined to offer any substantial support. By around 1223 or 1224, Jalal ad-Din had returned west, crossing back through Afghanistan into Persia, where the Mongol administrative presence was still being consolidated and the local power vacuum was deep enough that a determined commander with a corps of professional cavalry could carve out something resembling a position. He did. For approximately 7 years, Jalal ad-Din operated in Persia, Azerbaijan, and the Caucasus, winning battles, taking cities, imposing himself on local powers, maintaining a court in perpetual motion. He defeated a Georgian army at a battle near Garni in 1225. He took the city of Tabriz. He fought the Rum Seljuks. He fought the Abbasid Caliphate. He fought, it sometimes seemed, everyone, because coalition building in the post-Mongol collapse environment required fighting your potential allies into submission before you could recruit them as supporters. And by the time they were recruited, they were often more resentful than loyal. The administrative infrastructure he could not build without stability, the stability he could not achieve without administrative infrastructure. This is the trap that consumed his post-Indus decade. He could win engagements, he could take cities, he could demonstrate repeatedly that Jalal ad-Din Mingburnu in the field was a more dangerous man than any regional commander wanted to face directly. What he could not do was consolidate. The empire he was trying to rebuild required permanence, and permanence required trust, and trust required time that the Mongols did not give him. They came for him again in 1230 with a force that engaged his army in Azerbaijan. The Battle of Yasuchemen by the Aras River was decisive in the way that battles against the Mongols were typically decisive. Total. Jalal ad-Din's forces were broken. He fled alone or nearly alone into the mountains of Kurdistan. In 1231, a Kurdish tribesman found him, reportedly asleep or exhausted, and killed him. Some sources suggest the man was an assassin, sent by one of Jalal ad-Din's numerous enemies. By 1231, they were too numerous to count. Some suggest he was simply an opportunist who recognized a lone and vulnerable man in a region where lone and vulnerable men were worth robbing. The sources disagree on the details in ways that cannot be resolved from this distance. He died without a kingdom, without a court, without an heir who survived him in power, without having restored a single one of the cities that had been destroyed. He also died having done the thing at Parwan that no one else had managed, having beaten the Mongols in a pitched battle completely by understanding the ground and his own men's weakness more clearly than anyone else in either camp. The long-term consequences of the Khwarazmian collapse, the larger story within which Parwan is one episode, unfolded across the following decades. With the specific relentlessness of historical forces set in motion by catastrophic events, the power vacuum left by the destruction of the Khwarazmian Empire drew the Mongols progressively westward. In 1258, Hulagu Khan's Mongol force sacked Baghdad, killing the Abbasid Caliph al-Mustasim, in the process an event that ended an institution that had persisted for 5 centuries as the symbolic center of Sunni Islamic authority. The specific form of that destruction, the elimination of the political and religious infrastructure of the medieval Islamic world's most significant cities, is in the long causal chain that begins with the Mongol invasion of Khwarazm in 1219. Afghanistan itself, the specific landscape where Parwan was fought, went on to demonstrate the principle Jalal ad-Din had discovered with a consistency that history would find almost tedious if it were not also tragic. The Hindu Kush has a way of presenting to every army that enters it the same fundamental problem. This is ground where conventional military superiority does not translate cleanly into political control. The British discovered this in 3 separate wars in the 19th century. The Soviets discovered it between 1979 and 1989. The Americans and NATO discovered it after 2001. The mountains do not change. The principle does not change. The lesson that Jalal ad-Din taught Shigikutuku in 1221, that terrain can neutralize doctrine if you understand the terrain well enough and your enemy is committed enough to the doctrine, has been retaught in this same geography at enormous cost every time a force arrived with sufficient confidence in its own system to stop looking carefully at the ground beneath it. Most accounts of the Mongol conquest of Khwarazm give Parwan 2 paragraphs. In the larger narrative of Mongol expansion, the one that moves from the unification of the steppe tribes through the conquest of northern China, through the destruction of Khwarazm, toward the campaigns in Europe, and the eventual Mongol rule of most of the Eurasian landmass Parwan functions as a speed bump. Genghis Khan's forces suffered a temporary setback. Genghis Khan addressed the setback personally. The march of conquest resumed. The two paragraphs end, the narrative moves on. This framing is not wrong exactly. The strategic outcome is accurately stated. Parwan did not save Khwarazm, did not stop the Mongols, did not meaningfully alter the trajectory of the conquest. In strategic terms, it was a delay. What the two-paragraph treatment misses is everything that makes Parwan significant as a military and human event. The Persian historical tradition, particularly in Nasawi's biography, gives it very different weight, and given that Nasawi was Jalal ad-Din's court secretary, writing within living memory of these events, his account is the most detailed, near-contemporary source available. In Nasawi's telling, Parwan is not a speed bump. It is proof of legitimacy, the moment at which the last prince of Khwarazm demonstrated that his cause was just and his generalship was genuine. This reading is also not wrong. It is also not neutral. Nasawi was writing to honor a man he had served, and the hagiographic framework shapes which details he emphasizes and which he elides. The scholarly tradition most worth taking seriously, represented by historians like Timothy May, argues that Parwan has been underweighted in Western historiography, not because it was strategically minor, which it was, but because the Western tradition inherited its understanding of the Mongol conquests primarily through frameworks that treated Mongol expansion as a kind of natural force, like weather, rather than as a series of contingent military operations that could have gone differently at specific moments. Parwan is precisely such a moment, a contingent outcome produced by specific decisions, specific terrain, and one specific order to dismount. The voices that are simply not in the historical record are the Afghan and Khalaj fighters who held the ridgelines at Parwan. The Persian chronicles were written by literate court servants within the Persianate tradition. The secret history of the Mongols was written for the Mongol court. Neither had any particular motivation to document the experience, the motivations, or the specific tactical contribution of tribal fighters from the Hindu Kush. Those fighters, the men who actually knew the terrain, who held the high ground that made the dismount order viable, whose intimate knowledge of the valley floor and the ridgelines gave Jalal ad-Din's position its structural teeth, do not exist in the sources except as unnamed auxiliaries. They won the battle. History didn't write their names down. And then there is the detail that changes everything, the dismount order. Most accounts that mention it at all treat it as a tactical note, a commander making a reasonable decision about how to use difficult terrain. That framing is not wrong. It is profoundly incomplete. The dismount order was not a reasonable tactical decision in the way that choosing to anchor your flank on a river is a reasonable tactical decision. It was a decision that required a specific, honest, unflattering understanding of your own men's psychology specifically, the knowledge that they would run if they had the means to run, and the willingness to act on that knowledge rather than pretend otherwise. A commander who trusted his men would not have taken their horses. A commander who understood his men took the horses and won the battle. This is the reframing that most accounts miss, and it matters because it changes what Parwan is actually about. It is not a story about courage overcoming superior numbers. It is a story about one man's clear-eyed understanding of human weakness, his own side's weakness, his enemy's assumptive patterns translated into a tactical arrangement that turned both into advantages. The courage was real, but the courage was created by design, not inspired into existence. Jalal ad-Din didn't make his men brave. He made their fear irrelevant by removing the tool fear would have used. Understanding that reframes what kind of achievement Parwan was, and it reframes who Jalal ad-Din Mingburnu was, not the last romantic hero of a doomed civilization, but something harder to categorize and ultimately more instructive. A man who saw clearly because he had nothing left to see through. Return for a moment to the morning before the first Mongol rider appeared in the Gorban Valley. Jalal ad-Din gave the order to dismount. His men, some of them at least, must have understood what it meant. No horse means no exit. No exit means the fight in front of you is the only thing left. In a cavalry culture, being separated from your horse is not just a tactical position, it is a statement about the value you place on survival relative to something else. What was the something else? Not Khwarazm. Khwarazm was gone. Not his father's legacy. His father had died alone on an island, having fled what his son was now turning to face. Not the restoration of the great cities, they were ash. Not political legitimacy, he was a sultan of nothing, recognized by no functioning power on earth. What Jalal ad-Din had left in the spring of 1221, after everything else had been stripped away, was the problem directly in front of him. 30,000 Mongol veterans in a valley he had chosen. His own men's conditioned instinct to run. His enemy's absolute certainty in a doctrine that the terrain was about to make unworkable. These three things were the complete inventory. He had lost everything else. And because he had lost everything else, he could see these three things with a precision that people who still have things to protect rarely manage. He was not calculating what Parwan would mean for his political future. He was not weighing the battle's outcome against the court's opinion or the succession politics or the trade relationships that might be disrupted if he fought here rather than somewhere else. There was no court. There were no trade relationships. There was only the valley, the men, and the thing across the valley that was coming regardless. The institutional weight that makes most decision makers cautious, the need to protect the apparatus, the reputation, the relationship. The position had been removed by the Mongols in the previous 2 years. What remained was the problem and the man looking at it. This is not an argument for catastrophe as a path to wisdom. Jalal ad-Din paid for his clarity with his civilization, his family, and eventually his life. The cost was total. The clarity was real. Both things are true simultaneously, and the fact that both are true simultaneously is what makes Parwan worth more than 2 paragraphs, because the question Parwan actually asks is not military. It is not about cavalry doctrine or terrain selection or tribal coalition management, though it is about all of those things at the surface. The question underneath all of those is this: what do we see and what do we stop seeing because of what we have to protect? Shigi Kutuk rode into the Korban Valley with an unbroken record and a system that had produced that record. The record and the system were both real. They were also in that specific valley on those specific 2 days, exactly the things that prevented him from seeing the problem clearly. He knew what the problem should look like: a Khwarazmian cavalry force that would break under pressure on terrain that his system would handle, producing the outcome his system had always produced. What he found was a man who had designed the problem to look like something else entirely. Shigi Kutuk couldn't see it because he didn't need to look closely. His assumptions filled in what observation might have questioned. Jalal ad-Din had no assumptions left. He had only the valley. For the 48 hours of Parwan, that was enough. If this story reached you, if you found yourself thinking about the dismount order, about the horses, about the fracture that came 12 hours after the victory, then please take 1 second and hit like. It is the clearest signal to this platform that this kind of historical storytelling deserves to find more people, and it costs you nothing. This channel is built on exactly these stories. The moments where history turns not because of the largest army or the most resources, but because one person saw something more clearly than everyone else in the room. If you want to be here for the next one, subscribe. Oh, there are more stories like this one, and I want to bring them to you the same way. And one genuine question before you go. If the coalition had held after Parwan, if the horses had been distributed without conflict, if Timur Melik had stayed, if Jalal ad-Din had kept the force that broke Shigi Kutuk's army intact, do you think he could have built something that lasted? Or was the fracture inevitable, not because of the horses, but because of what the coalition actually was? Leave your answer in the comments. I'll read them and see you in the next one.